Another thing to look at in the first 100 days is that so far he has managed to compile the biggest increase in the right track, wrong track number of any president of modern times since this number began to be tracked. And for the first time since early 2004, right after the capture of Saddam Hussein, the country believes that the country is on the right track.
Welcome to the Miller Center Forum. Our guest today is Todd Purdum. Todd Purdum is the national editor and political correspondent for Vanity Fair. Todd was educated at St. Paul's School and Princeton University. Following graduation, he joined the New York Times, and he served as the Los Angeles bureau chief for the Times. From 1994 to 1997, he was a White House correspondent for the Times. And in addition to sort of old-fashioned shoe leather reporting, Todd Purdum became known as the journalist who could pull together big, complex, fast-breaking stories and write a comprehensive, lucid summary on short deadline. Very important, particularly for a paper like the New York Times that will cover major events in depth. While he was at the Times, he wrote a book, A Time of Our Choosing, America's War in Iraq, which came out in 2003 and really was the first draft of the history of the run-up to the war. In 2005, Todd Purdum joined Vanity Fair. There he has produced outstanding long pieces, including an oral history of the Bush administration, but his most famous piece was the piece published last summer called The Comeback Id about Bill Clinton. President Clinton apparently didn't really like the piece, and he called Purdum a dishonest reporter, a real slimy guy. And that was just for starters. When reminded that Purdum is married to Clinton's former press secretary, D.D. Myers, the former president said, "That's all right, he's still a scumbag." Todd Purdum is a close observer of contemporary politics and politicians, and right now he is working on a long piece about future presidential contender Sarah Palin. Please welcome Todd Purdum.
Thank you very much, George.
You don't really
Thanks a
look
lot.
slimy.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. It's really nice to be here, and thank you, George, for that very generous introduction. I could quote President Clinton, who used to say when he would receive a similarly generous introduction at a dinner or something, "We could stop right now and have had a very nice evening." But it's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to be in Charlottesville. The drive down was beautiful today. The dogwoods, the redbuds are all at their peak. We've been having a kind of lingering winter in Washington, which I gather you have here too, so it's nice to really be here in spring. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about a topic like the first 100 days of the Obama administration, because living in Washington these days is, it's a very unusual time to be in Washington. And on all my exposure, which dates really to late 1993 off and on, I don't remember a time quite like this. And I'm glad to see my distinguished predecessor as the junior warden of St. Patrick's Episcopal Church here, Nancy Gordon, because one of the things that strikes me every Sunday morning in church, in every Episcopal church in the Diocese of Washington or the Diocese of Virginia or all around the country for that matter, congregations that used to pray for presidents named George and William now pray for one named Barack, a Swahili derivative of an Arabic name that means blessed. And it has common roots in the Hebrew name Baruch. The spring catalog of Brooks Brothers arrived at our house a few weeks ago with a cover photo featuring an elegant African-American couple holding hands, the woman in a sleek, sleeveless, cream-colored sheath. A city long used to seeing its most prominent resident only on television is getting used to the idea that he might pop up almost anywhere, at a Wizards game, at Ben's Chili Bowl, or a parent-teacher conference at the Sidwell Friends School. And the President's Sports Bar in the Renaissance Hotel downtown now features a sepia-toned photograph of a beaming little brown boy swinging a baseball bat in Hawaii, alongside a shot of Jimmy Carter having just made a hit at home plate and Warren Harding holding a golf club. If Washington in the age of Obama is not a city totally transformed, it's certainly one whose mood and feel, whose affect and atmosphere are strikingly different from the 8 years of the Bush administration, and for that matter, from the previous 200 years as well. It hasn't been very much remarked on, but it's still remarkable. A White House resident staff that for generations has been composed overwhelmingly of black butlers and ushers now helps take care of 2 little black girls whose dad is the boss. The concept of a second coming of Camelot has already become a cliche in Washington, but it's true that the town has not experienced such a collective change of mood since that young PT boat skipper named John Kennedy replaced the Supreme Allied Commander of World War II, not quite 7 months before Barack Obama was born. In 1962, the venerable United Press International White House correspondent Merriman Smith, who had covered the death of FDR for UPI and went on to cover the death of John F. Kennedy and win a Pulitzer Prize, summed up the change that what he called the new people, or NP, of the new frontier had brought to Eisenhower-era Washington. He said, "We've reached a point in history where just about the best sign of being in is to have been shoved fully clothed into a swimming pool at Bobby Kennedy's during a native fiesta for new people." Life in Washington and in the whole world is a lot more serious these days, of course, and the economic collapse has suppressed some of the Obama's natural ebullience in the same way that the September 11th attacks and 2 wars exacerbated George W. Bush's normal nursing home dinner hour and early bedtime. But an invitation to watch, or better to play, basketball with the new president is surely the greatest mark of having arrived, at least for those people who can't manage to get invited to the Wednesday night pizza and strategy session with the president's senior advisor, David Axelrod. Todd Gray, whose Equinox restaurant became the first place the Obamas dined out at night just before the inauguration, told me that Washington has come alive with the Obamas. My friend and colleague Mark Knoller of CBS News, who keeps track of presidential travel, presidential sports, how many times someone goes to Camp David, counted that in the first 50 days, President Obama had been out in the evening for fun a total of 9 times. By contrast, in the first 6 months of 2007, George W. Bush dined out purely for pleasure only 3 times in the homes of old aides and friends, and his staff considered that pace a radical improvement that they'd had to work hard to achieve. But the sparkle that the residents of the White House have brought to Washington comes from more than just star power and glitz. From the point of view of Democrats, the Obamas have combined the Clintons' good ideas with the Bushes' good manners. On the weekend before the inauguration, the Obamas held a dinner at Blair House for their siblings and in-laws and their children, as well as top aides and their families. It was precisely the kind of affair the Clintons hardly ever had, in part because their own extended families brought more complications than a healthy appetite to the family dinner table. But while we're in a culinary mode here, I should stop a little bit and sort of talk in a broader way about what I think Barack Obama is trying to do in Washington, which is actually, in its own calm way, a fairly radical thing. He's trying to break the pattern that has developed in which everyone plays an inside game, trying to win a daily news cycle or even a cycle of a few hours. He's playing, as he said himself, for the long term. In his recent press conference, he really was quite frank at the end of it in saying that he's got his eye on the longer term. I was reading the other day, going back in his book, The Audacity of Hope, and there's a wonderful passage in there in which he talks about having just concluded his first term in the Illinois State Senate. And I'm from Illinois. My hometown is Macomb, which is about 250 miles southwest of Chicago, and it's farming country, and my family's all lived there one way or another for about the better part of 150 years. So I know the state pretty well. But Obama writes about being in downstate Illinois for the first extended time. He took an aide with him, just the 2 of them. And the nervous young aide warned him, now strictly cotton polo shirts and khaki pants. No silk shirts or linen pants. Obama said, I don't have any silk shirts or linen pants. Believe me, it's okay. So they stopped at a TGI Fridays, and Obama ordered a cheeseburger. And the waitress brought the food, and he asked, do you have any Dijon mustard? And the aide said, oh, he doesn't want any Dijon mustard. Here's French's. This is right fine. And the waitress looked at them both and said, you want Dijon? We got Dijon. And I think at some level, what Obama is doing is trusting the people to pass the Grey Poupon. He's not afraid of being pigeonholed as an elitist or someone who wants something a little bit different. He trusts the people to level with them. So I think he's pretty confident that when he shakes hands with Hugo Chavez, nobody's going to mistake him for coddling up to a troublesome person in our hemisphere. They're going to think he has good manners, which are never inappropriate. When he releases these torture memos from the Bush administration, except for Dick Cheney, I don't think too many people are really going to accuse him of actively trying to put Americans in greater risk. I think they will get the point that he is arguing, that America is never safer than when it holds the essential values that the world has looked to for 200 years as a model. Even when he takes on all these problems at once, and someone says, how can you be reforming health care? You should be concentrating on the economy. I think he trusts people to understand that the health system is 1/8 of the economy, and that ultimately you can't fix the economy if you don't do something about health care. When people say you're taking on too much in general, I think he trusts people to understand that the world is a complicated place, and all of this is washing over him. And so far, he's had, I think, in some ways, you have to say, remarkable success. No, he hasn't gotten any votes from the Republican caucus in Congress for the biggest legislative initiatives. That's not really surprising, considering that most Republican members of Congress' biggest worry, is a primary challenge from the right in their own districts, which over the last 2-3 decades have been drawn to be so hyper-partisan as to protect incumbents and to not force competitive races. So I think what the Obama people are focusing on, and I had occasion to have breakfast recently with a group of reporters and David Plouffe, who was President Obama's campaign wunderkind, they're focusing on the overall support of the public, which you have to say is rather astounding. The latest CBS New York Times poll showed that he had a job approval rating of 66%. Well, so Karl Rove was arguing the other day that he's quickly become the most polarizing president in history because he has such extreme support, 88% among Democrats, only 25 or 27% support among Republicans. But you don't get to 66% overall job approval rating without having a lot of support from independents and, yes, Republicans, unless Democrats constitute a far larger portion of the general electorate than Karl Rove is willing to concede they do. So one of the things that David Plouffe told us was that the network of supporters that they developed in the campaign, that extraordinary email network and list of names, that they felt kept them afloat, not only financially, but in terms of political support through all that long season when it wasn't clear whether he or Hillary Clinton would get the nomination, especially in late 2007, is still at work, and they're still communicating with all those supporters. And David's theory was that at a soccer game or a water cooler, when somebody says, oh, the president's doing a terrible job, or look at this budget with all these deficits in the years ahead, the Obama supporter will, neighbor to neighbor, friend to friend, turn and say, oh, no, and then repeat the things that came in the email box that morning and make a sort of counter-argument. And I think their theory, and I don't know if they can actually prove this empirically or through focus groups or other ways, but I think their theory is that his overall support is being borne aloft by that kind of buttressing factor. Another thing to look at in the first 100 days is that so far he has managed to compile the biggest increase in the right track, wrong track number of any president of modern times since this number began to be tracked. And for the first time since early 2004, right after the capture of Saddam Hussein, the country believes once again, by a small balance, sort of 44 to 41 or something like that, that the country is on the right track. So at some level, whatever the chattering classes in Washington are saying and whatever the Republicans in Congress may be saying, and whatever Karl Rove and Dick Cheney may be saying, the public is giving Obama a lot of room to work, and their polls consistently show extraordinary amount of patience. He gets ratings as being more trusted than any other single figure, more trusted than the chairman of the Federal Reserve or the Treasury Secretary or anyone else to deal with the financial problems, more trusted certainly than Congress. So that's not to say that the biggest work is not all still ahead of him. It obviously is. It's quite clear that on things like health care, he's got his work cut out for him. I think within the administration, based on reporting among aides to the White House, the biggest single concern for a lot of them is his proposal to have a cap-and-trade plan for carbon emissions to reduce global warming. I think they're really worried that could be the third rail, and Congress could distract attention from a lot of other things. I think many people, especially of the moderate stripe in the administration, are worried that that could be one of those really dangerous topics. In some ways, like gun control was 15 years ago for President Clinton, one of those topics that could sink a whole range of other items on an agenda. But for the moment, the president is keeping his head up and keeping his eye on the longer term. The thing about Republicans, they may not be voting with him at the moment, but even Republicans, at least the permanent Washington kind of Republican, never really cottoned very much to President Bush's personal abstemiousness. So they've gladly accepted Obama's invitations for cocktails at the White House, even if they vote against him lockstep just as happily. It's true that hopes for a brave new era of bipartisanship may have faded, but as Charlie Cook, the veteran political analyst, told me the other day, it's awfully tough to be a Republican or a conservative of any kind in Washington these days, and many people in the Republican Party are convinced that it'll take a long time for them to claw their way back to where they were. Washington is one of those places, of course, where everything old is always new again. And I was reading the other day a report from Frank Carpenter, who was the very colorful Washington correspondent for the Cleveland Leader in the 1880s. And in 1883, he wrote that there was a fairy tale sense of instability about Washington, which he called one vast boarding house, a city of toadies, always cheering for the party on top. But there's also a kind of constancy to the anthropology of Washington, and that's meant there's a sizable number of non-toadies who are not cheering for Obama. The truth is that modern Washington is still far more used to having Republicans in the White House than Democrats. The Republicans have held the White House for 28 of the last 40 years. And I think most of the people in Washington's permanent governing class, and that includes media, lobbying, politicians, still tends to think of Republicans as better organized, more efficient, more professional. The grown-up party, the daddy party as it's sometimes called. And that's led to a predictable clash of cultures. It was fascinating to see that the mere fact that Obama, like most American working professional men, chooses to appear in the Oval Office from time to time in shirt sleeves and not just in the suit coat that President Bush considered de rigueur, has occasioned serious commentary and some stern scolding from former Bush aides. The White House Press Corps, my other alma mater, is another immutable Washington power base, though I have to say with some sadness that budget cuts and the decline of the newspaper industry and the rise of the internet have made it a shadow of its once robust self. I've been to the White House briefing room quite a lot in recent weeks, and apart from the fact that it's always overflow, standing room only crowd, I really had never seen it so crowded except during the days of President Clinton's impeachment. It's very familiar. White House reporters still ask Robert Gibbs all the same sorts of tendentious, self-aggrandizing questions that I used to ask, with perhaps an added zing born of their declining relevance. I was fascinated to see, for example, that on the day the president unveiled his $3.6 or $8 trillion budget proposal, I won't name her because it's not fair, but the chief White House reporter for the Associated Press, who's a fine reporter, and it's the world's largest news-gathering organization, chose to begin the briefing, the first question that day about this huge budget, by asking Robert Gibbs, Robert, the president today said that sometimes a family should redecorate its house and other times it should repair the foundation. Do you think that's an appropriate metaphor, considering that the Obamas are right now redecorating the family living quarters of the White House? This was the first question of the day. And I have to say, even a little distance from the daily fray of the White House made me think that was not the most appropriate question that you could find to ask. It turns out, of course, a few days later, the Obamas let it be known that they were declining the $100,000 government allowance to redo the White House and paying for it out of their own pocket. Robert Gibbs had a pretty good answer, which was the last time he checked, the previous occupant of the White House did not have two little girls. But so I have a 9-year-old daughter, and I know that the decorating tastes of 9-year-olds are not the same as their parents often. The Democrats in Congress have also pursued their own agenda. Sometimes they've been very respectful of Obama. They certainly are aware of his popularity. But I think a lot of them have the attitude that they were in Washington before he got there and they'll be in Washington after he's gone. So they certainly are not saluting at everything he wants. I don't think they're behaving with anything like the kind of reverence that the Republicans in Congress typically showed to President Reagan. And their attitude is one of skepticism. You saw that just yesterday in his meeting with congressional leaders when he's trying to sort of tamp down any impulse to do too much backward looking on the torture question. There are these proposals for a truth commission or some kind of ongoing investigation in Congress. Speaker Pelosi was apparently not shy yesterday about letting her view be known that she thought something like that might be appropriate. It's not clear what will happen. And it's not clear what power any president has to control, and it's appropriate, what power he has to control the priorities of Congress. So, of course, the notion that everyone in Washington is happy that Obama is president is just that, of course, a notion. The other day, I saw a perfectly normal-looking man walking down MacArthur Boulevard in Northwest Washington, wearing a black T-shirt with large white letters in front and back saying, "Obama Nation is abomination." And in Washington, as everywhere else, change comes hard and it can be fleeting. The summer Brooks Brothers catalog has just arrived, and its cover features a cheerful WASP family of mother, father, and son in sockless loafers, spectator shoes, and go-to-hell pants in a Kennebunkport shade of lemon chiffon that might make even our friend and neighbor Tucker Carlson blush. So, I'm glad to be here today, but I'd really, this audience is always so well informed and your questions are so good that what I'd most like to do is try to take a few of them and see where the discussion might lead. So thanks very much.
I'm going to move to the back of the room and take as many questions as we have time for, but let me start with this, if I may, Todd. Lee Edwards from the Heritage Foundation was here several weeks ago, and in response to a question about whether or not Republicans should despair, he said, well, remember that 4 years after Lyndon Johnson's landslide, we elected Richard Nixon. And 4 years after Jimmy Carter's surprising victory, we elected Ronald Reagan. And then 2 years after Clinton was elected, we took over the House and the Senate and retained control for many years. So we shouldn't despair. But the question remains, what is the voice of the Republican Party? Right now, the voice seems to be Dick Cheney or possibly Sarah Palin, but there has not emerged a strong congressional leadership. So what is your guess as to who will win the heart of the Republicans, and who will be their voice, and where will that lead?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, and it's a point well taken that American politics is quite volatile in that way. In 1946, the congressional Republicans, had routed the Democrats and said that to err was Truman, but 2 years later, Harry Truman, of course, won the biggest comeback victory of all time. I think one of the things that's interesting is that there isn't a clear spokesman now. Congressman Cantor of Virginia is being rather careful to direct his fire at Speaker Pelosi and not at the president. He's not being particularly cooperative with the president, but he's not attacking the president either. In 1968, it was fascinating because a person like Nixon was, of course, hardly a new figure. He'd been around for a long time. He'd been biding his time. Some of you may have read this recent book by Rick Perlstein called Nixonland, which is a very persuasive argument that the forces in American life that propelled Nixon to the presidency in 1968 in the midst of civil strife and the Vietnam War and concern over crime and all the rest of it, this whole silent majority question, still very much alive and pulsing in America today, and in some ways represented by the kind of politics that Karl Rove has pursued as the strategist for President Bush. So I would in no way say that the Republicans couldn't reemerge. It's interesting. At the moment, the biggest voices in the party do seem to be voices from the past, whether that's Vice President Cheney or Speaker Newt Gingrich. And he's the smartest person, sort of pound for pound, in Washington in many ways still. And I would not discount his strategy. Although he's been interesting because a couple years ago he was saying the party, even a few months ago, he was saying the party had to have a fresh approach and some creative, forward-looking ideas if it was going to prosper. In the more recent period, he seems to be joining the just say no chorus and think that blocking initiatives is a good idea. The Republicans in modern times do have a history of overreaching, whether overreaching in the Bush administration in trying to do Social Security, for which there was no real constituency, or in the case of President Clinton, vastly overreaching on impeachment when the public fundamentally didn't support that, and it boomeranged back against them in a real way. So I don't know. I think part of the question that is interesting is whether Governor Palin can emerge as a figure in the future. At the moment, she's in rather severe trouble at home in Alaska. Her fellow Republicans have been voting against her there in the state legislative session that's now ending. They joined Democrats in rejecting her nominee for Attorney General, which is the first time in the history of Alaska statehood that a governor's cabinet appointee had been rejected. So she's got a lot of trouble at home, and she may find it more appealing to come down to the lower 48 and run for president. But I think she has a critical mass of support in the Republican Party, and I think there are many moderates in the party that would find her hard to take. And I think in a general election campaign, she would also have a hard time for all the reasons that we know from last fall.
Thank you very much. I'm John Lineweaver. I'm a visitor. I was born in the United States, was not born in any state. Washington, D.C. in 1925. In 1932, on July 29th, I was tear gassed by General MacArthur, Lieutenant Eisenhower, and Lieutenant Bradley, just out of West Point. They thought we were bonus marchers trying to get back home to Alexandria. So I was born in Sibley Hospital in Washington, D.C., the old one. Now, my question is a kind of a general question. Our predicament on this planet is in jeopardy. Every 60 minutes, the population of the Earth goes up 9,000. That's net gain, profit, after you subtract deaths from births. I wonder how long is Obama's long-term perspective in this regard, because our footprint on the planet is pushing our place on the planet into jeopardy or collapse. If you've read Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, and I wonder how long or when he will see the whole perspective of evolution and the overpopulation.
Well, I think that's a very good question, and it's a very complicated answer because in journalism, one of the things that we're the worst at is covering the biggest questions for which there are no immediate answers, and in which what's the word I'm looking for? The explosion date is some way in the future. My colleague and old New York Times friend who now works at the New Yorker, Betsy Colbert, actually writes about these topics a lot. I think Obama will struggle to get the attention of the American public on these kinds of questions. We still tend to think of ourselves as, kind of exceptional and not having to follow the rules. Western Europe, Northern Europe, long ago made its peace with using far less energy. It was interesting. We were traveling in France last summer and in England the fall before that with our children, and you go to a fast food restaurant or something like that, and one paper napkin is what you get, and a request for a second one is met with a real distaste. Friends of ours sent their kids to the American school in London, and they were firmly instructed not to send lunches in anything like plastic bags. They were supposed to send them in containers that could be used over and over again, or wrapped in brown paper, something that could be repurposed. So I think, given the worry that these people were expressing to me the other day about something like cap and trade, I think those questions are hard, and they're probably hard for any American president to get the public to focus on. We tend to focus on them when gas is $4.50, and when it's $2 and change, everyone forgets. So I think I don't have much confidence that it'll get addressed in the next 4 years.
Mr. Purdum, I'm a strong Obama supporter, but I'm worried. And I'm worried this week largely about the torture memos and the decision not to prosecute the interrogators. And what I thought, based on what Rahm Emanuel said over the weekend, sort of a go slow on those who drafted the legal opinions. And my question to you is he tough enough? As you know, Washington's really hurly-burly. And if they can see some daylight, and I have to say I'm reminded of the Carter administration, if they can see some daylight between what a president announces is his policy and what he eventually is willing to compromise for or roll back to, he's in trouble, in my view. I feel strongly that the memos should have come out. They would have come out eventually anyway, and I think the decision with respect to not prosecuting was strong, but it's a tough decision, and he's got to hold to it.
I think you put your finger on something. Driving down in the car this morning, I'm sure many of you were listening to NPR or other radio this morning. There does seem to be congealing now a kind of quick conventional wisdom of this week that the president stepped in it a little bit the other day in the Oval Office with King Abdullah when he seemed to leave the door open to prosecuting or otherwise sanctioning the authors of these memos or the architects of the interrogation policy, while having ruled out the prosecution of individual acts. I think it's possible that he was trying to be nuanced there on a question of administrative sanctions short of prosecution. I think, based on my reading of just the newspapers like the rest of you, there's very little precedent, and it's thought to be very tricky to prosecute lawyers criminally for giving what they thought was their best advice. One of the points that was made also is that John Yoo, one of the architects of these policies, was well known for having such a, let's say, idiosyncratic view of presidential power that it would be hard to prove that his argument that these kinds of activities were allowable was at odds with his overall belief about what a president could do, period. I mean, he really almost takes the position that President Nixon took, that, quote, when the president does it, it isn't a crime. But so I think he's probably in very dangerous ground now. And as you see the left and in Congress and groups like Move On and so forth, they're putting a lot of pressure on him to allow some prosecution. If I had to guess what he's trying to do is to say to Joe Doak's interrogator for the CIA, you're not going to be punished for doing what your supervisors told you to do and what the hierarchy of the United States government told you to do. But I don't think he'd be unhappy if somehow people got to the bottom of this and somebody was somehow held accountable. There's a strange way in which I think he doesn't want to be seen as taking the lead on that, but there comes a point where he can't block it either, because to block it is to say, it didn't matter. It either mattered and it was very, very important and we have to get to the bottom of it and resolve it in the system that we have, which is a system of laws and courts and judges, or it wasn't so important, and then we shouldn't have wasted all this time on it anyway. And I think he's definitely of the view that it's important. So, but just to your broader question is about whether he's tough, I think people who have underestimated his toughness in the past have almost uniformly come away deciding he was plenty tough. So I don't think he makes a fuss about things, but there was a quote in the paper today, I think, or yesterday, from some aide of his saying he's not very sentimental. And if someone isn't serving his purposes, he'll drop them. And I wrote a long piece about his early life and his childhood, basically, and his coming of age years. And the sense I got from people who knew him was that he's always been a pretty cool customer. So, and he kept his cool certainly in a campaign that would have made a lot of other people go soft. So I think that the jury's, maybe out on that, but I wouldn't bet against his toughness.
If cap and trade on emissions is the third rail of politics, does the recent ruling more empowering the EPA take some pressure off of pushing for that? Does the EPA have control not only on automobile emissions, but also industrial emissions under that ruling? And is it likely to push Congress to some action?
That's a good question. You're catching me I could not present myself as an expert on environmental policy, but I think that one of the things the President and the White House would probably argue is that given the general overall postural change in environmental regulation represented by the administration's coming to power and by the Lisa Jackson, the new EPA administrator, and Carol Browner, the White House environmental czar, that regardless of whether they get something so specific as cap and trade enshrined in law, that in all the host of ways that the government has administrative power to do things about the environment, that the balance has been firmly tipped in favor of doing things after what they would regard as, 2 terms of not doing things. So it may take some pressure off, and it may be one of those proposals that's aspirational and it's out there as a goalpost. And the history of these things is, they usually don't get past the first time around, but if they are out there as a goal, people inch closer and closer toward them. So they may well be, that may be their fallback position.
I want to ask you a couple of questions, maybe 3 altogether. The first has to do with the sort of new names that we seem to have for things like the war on terror. That's one of the changes that apparently he's made, and I'm forgetting some of the terms, like for the detainees and for the war on terror, instead of those now, and also the war in Afghanistan. Can you first straighten me out on what I'm supposed to do now instead of saying detainees and war on terror?
I think it's all, language is very much, it does reflect reality, and it reflects priorities in some senses. Personally, global war on terror, or GWAT, was never a very good, moniker for me. I think it's interesting because I don't think the administration has been ostentatious about this, but they have very sort of definitely left some of those terms behind. I think the sort of philosophical underpinning of it is that, as has been widely remarked ever since 9/11, we're a country that is, at war in 2 places, hot shooting wars on the ground, but we certainly have a home front and a sort of civic culture in general that doesn't feel at all, to most people who don't have, family members or friends in the military, it does not feel like an all-out sacrificial cause the way World War II most recently and most, tellingly did for people. And I think as the Bush administration wound to a close, one of the regrets that you saw many people who'd served in that administration, as well as many Democratic critics, cite was that somehow the administration had never taken the extreme patriotism and emotions of unity and so forth that were prevalent after 9/11 and turned them into some kind of constructive, albeit perhaps symbolic action. So I think maybe the administration thinks it's better not to toss around the word like a global war on terror too easily at a time when the public doesn't really seem to be invested in something that could be called a war. But I don't think for a minute it means they don't think it's just as grave, and obviously, as you see, President Obama has sort of doubled down on the whole question of Afghanistan and really made a pretty big bet on being able to make an improvement there. So.
The other has to do with our dealing with foreign countries, since there's a great deal of promise about we would have changes in our relationships. And there have been changes in relationships. For example, in Europe, the young people of Europe are highly in favor of Barack Obama, as they are in the United States. But the leaders, though, seem to be sort of aside from this and taking a little different view. I think Sarkozy said he's a little young for the job, or something about his inexperience. And I'd like to hear your reaction to this form of change.
Well, I think it's interesting because obviously hopes were very high in many parts of the world for the change. I think expectations have perhaps been a little bit unrealistic about how quickly things would change. I think this morning in Politico, David Axelrod, the president's senior advisor, was joking about how the trip to Europe had not automatically changed things overnight and had not resulted in big new troop commitments from Western European countries for Afghanistan. And he said, no one thought this would happen overnight. We think it'll take a few weeks. And he was kidding. But I think it's dangerous to underestimate the importance of these tonal changes. And also remember, early in his administration, President Kennedy had a pretty bad encounter with Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna. He famously told Scotty Reston of the New York Times off the record that Khrushchev had savaged him. And Khrushchev came away from that thinking that Kennedy was a lightweight who could be rolled. And of course, as we know, a few months later in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the precise opposite turned out to be true. So I think that it would be dangerous to read too much into it, but it would be well to be aware that there's not going to be overnight nirvana or instantaneous changes.
In describing the first 100 days in the beginning of your talk, one could call that the honeymoon period. And one could premise that Obama's popularity is about at its peak for the next 4 years. Can you imagine or discuss areas that could undermine his popularity and his effectiveness? A couple areas that come to my mind would be that the economy would continue to tank. I'm pretty concerned about what's going on in Pakistan, and I have no idea how we're going to deal with that. Perhaps the health care plan will not come together. What are your thoughts about these areas, and can you add some others?
No, I think those are well-taken points, and I think the one thing I would say is that not every 100 days is a honeymoon, and he's benefited tremendously from the goodwill and sense of refreshment that has attended the change of administrations. Someone who was actually there at the time pointed out to me that, when JFK took over, there was a lot of fresh air in Washington, but no one had hated General Eisenhower. No one was really, eager to get rid of him. Whereas there was a big segment of the population that was really ready to have a change from President Bush. So Obama has benefited just from not being President Bush. He may well be at the peak of his popularity, and I think the dangers you cite are very real. If there's not some improvement in the economy that seems discernible, and if all the government money that's been spent doesn't seem to be producing any yield, I think people will get pretty skeptical. Pakistan and Afghanistan and the whole situation in Iraq, if the president for some reason is not able to begin drawing down the troops in the timetable he's outlined, I think that will be a source of tremendous disappointment on his left flank, tremendous source of cynicism and potential frustration among the broader public, who's been led to believe that that will wind down. Healthcare, certainly, if he holds out the possibility of that and then doesn't get anything done, the bottom line is he will ultimately have to get some things done. And I think that makes the White House nervous because they know it. But I also continue to think that the Republicans also will have to get something done eventually, because they cannot run, I think it would be very hard for them to run in the current environment, on the just say no platform without having any alternative ideas of their own. And I think one of the things that might happen on health care is that a White House advisor was saying the other day that ever since President Truman's initial proposal for universal coverage, the way that progress has been made on health care is by covering defined populations. So first everyone basically agrees on covering the elderly with Medicare. Then people agree on covering the poor, Medicaid. Now there's wide agreement through the CHIPS program on covering children. Probably the next step will be a program that provides some kind of portability of insurance, and insurance that's, like the kind of insurance government employees can get, which may cover a big chunk of people that would leave the vulnerable population that I think some people are most worried about now is that comparatively small but still significant slice of people who make too much money to qualify for Medicaid but don't have private health insurance through their work or some other ways, and are kind of the working, the working lower middle class or whatever you want to call them. So I think that's a problem. And I think that, Washington as a place and as a political culture has gotten so used to thinking that nothing can get done, that if Obama can't change that, that's the most important thing he could change. And I think the public will, the public can turn, we see the public can turn on people with a great deal of swiftness if they don't get the results they want.
I've been allowed a second question. And,
that's the new rule in the White House briefing, by the way. Everyone packs 2 questions into one. So,
the second one has really to do with not with substance, but with style. And first, I must admit, I was more of a Clintonite than an Obamaniac during the last year. And it also seems that we're seeing Obama on the tube and in the newspaper constantly, far more obviously than President Bush. Do you think there's a potential for saturation here? I might find myself pushing back a little bit. I find myself being lectured to. I find this stern style that we have as opposed to the campaign a little off-putting. And do you think over time that there could be a reaction to this?
I think there is some potential danger to that. They know full well, the Obama administration, that he's by far their best salesman. So they use him a lot. And they deploy him in these settings because they know that the press corps will have no choice but to cover what he says because he is the president, and lesser officials might not draw the same attention. I thought in the early going, before Secretary Geithner particularly seemed to find his footing, as in recent weeks he seemed to find his footing. But it seemed problematic to me that the only person who could speak with any credibility or authority on the economy was the president himself, and they weren't able to field other people on the morning shows or the evening news. And in fact, one day when the press secretary, Robert Gibbs, was out there on the White House lawn on every single morning show, I thought he was not the most he was not the most effective person you could deploy on a giant topic like this, because you really don't want I have great respect for White House press secretaries, but you don't want the White House press secretary to be the chief economic policy steward and the spokesperson of the United States government. I think that, President Obama is a somewhat stern presence. The one thing that he does not conspicuously have that, for example, JFK did have is this kind of what Mary McCrory called his lightsome tread, and he doesn't have I think he has a very well-developed sense of humor, but he doesn't have a strong sense of irony or ironic distance the way that Kennedy did. And he seems rather earnest at times, and he can be professorial, and I'm sure it could wear on people after a while. I think they do feel, though, that he remains, well, as he said to the automakers, my administration is the only thing between you and the pitchforks, and I think, or the bankers rather, he said that too, and I think he. It's a little bit like Marshal Pétain, who came and said, "I make a gift of myself to the people of France." There's a part of Obama that is, for the moment, l'état c'est lui. I mean, he is kind of trying to be everything to everybody, and I think history shows that the president's time and the president's exposure is very precious. And certainly early in the Clinton administration, Clinton aides realized as they'd be in airports and see the president on television and see the public just walking by paying no attention, that he was probably overexposed. And of course, he was famously overexposed in undignified, what came to be seen as undignified settings, jogging clothes, or answering every question on the fly, or having too many, answering every question. Sorry, what did I say? I must have said something. Overexposed. Sorry. Well, anyway. But yes, I think it's a real question, and I think the one thing that protects him at the moment a little bit is fierce discipline. It does seem that at least he doesn't seem to be lurching into these frequent appearances. He seems to be making them on purpose, and maybe they will dial them down.
Let me comment that so far all the questioners have been male-gendered persons, and we are equal opportunity. We welcome and indeed solicit questions from female-gendered persons.
Don Wells, Charlottesville. Wanted to ask you to comment on the word reconciliation. Now, that's a legislative matter, except that the Obama administration is surely going to be involved in deciding whether to use that legislative tool, and if so, on what matters. And it's pretty clear they think they're going to use it on health care, but I gather not on cap and trade and so on. How do they make this decision? Who makes it? And can you clarify for us this process? And, oh yes, isn't it true that the Bush administration did it too?
Yes, recent administrations have used it. It was designed, as I understand it, and Senator Byrd would probably blanch at my misexplanation of this, but it was designed for a very specific purpose, to limit debate relative to certain particular kinds of things, and not to limit debate in questions of broad social and economic policy. I personally think there would be a lot of risks to using it for something as important as health care. As to who would make the decision, I think Rahm Emanuel and the president would single-handedly be very involved in making that decision together. The late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York, who was one of my teachers in the sense that I covered him frequently, and he was very learned and always eager to share that knowledge. He said, relative to the Clinton healthcare proposal and welfare and other matters, that these kinds of things, don't and can't pass 51 to 49. They have to pass 80-20, or they don't pass at all. And they shouldn't pass at all because there has to be wide spread support for changes so fundamental. Everyone in Washington at the moment seems to have given up the notion that they could ever achieve such support. But I think history has certainly shown that presidents are best served when they have the broadest possible reflection of support. So I think it would be problematic if they use either one. And I think I guess the conventional sense is they may well try to use it on health care. But I think they have to be very careful about doing it and be seen as shoving something down people's throats that they don't want to have.
It seems to me that Obama did a good job of putting into place in his administration a lot of his appointments as he got started. But in 100 days, we have a chance to judge some of his appointments. This morning's Times shows a picture of a meeting between Obama and the credit card companies, and it shows Larry Summers asleep at the meeting. And we know Stephen Chu, and he seems to be getting quite a lot of criticism in his job as Energy Secretary. Could you comment on and you've already said too that you think Obama would be willing to get rid of people who aren't effective. What is your opinion of his appointments? And I know some of them haven't been approved in Congress yet, but do you think that he would make any changes soon in any of his administration?
I'm sure there are probably some veterans of the Clinton administration and of the Harvard faculty who think it would be a good thing if Larry Summers is dozing once in a while, as opposed to, if the choice is shouting or dozing, they'd probably rather have him be dozing. I think Obama in the beginning, got credit for being very much on pace or ahead of schedule with his appointees. They were, by and large, non-controversial appointees at worst, and at best, they were considered to be really very competent. He got spooked, obviously, because of the issue with Secretary Geithner and the taxes, and then Tom Daschle, and that caused a tremendous delay in the process and a great deal of fearfulness about making a mistake going forward. So, as you probably all read, filling the ranks of the Treasury Department with the deputies and assistant secretaries has taken a really long time, and there's a feeling that poor Secretary Geithner was Macaulay Culkin there home alone in the... And in fact, I heard from his aides, a lot of people were pulling all-nighters, and the skeleton staff spending the night on the couches of the office to try to get the work done that they had to get done. I think one of the interesting things to me is President Obama got some criticism for appointing what were seen as, retreads from the Clinton administration, but I think back to how hard it was for President Clinton to put together his administration because he didn't have a deep bench. The Carter administration was already 12 years in the past, was seen by many as a kind of a failed one-term Democratic administration. I think it's interesting to see what a deep bench of talent and frankly what a diverse reservoir of talent the Clinton administration has produced, so that at the kind of deputy and assistant level particularly there's a great deal more diversity without seeming to work so hard at it as the Clinton administration did in terms of racial and ethnic diversity. My wife, I think I can say this without speaking out of turn, is a little concerned, more than a little concerned, that she thinks President Obama has not appointed enough women to senior posts, and his inner circle is really overwhelmingly male and always has been throughout the campaign. And I think I read a figure the other day that only a quarter of his top appointees across all spectrum have been women, which I think, given their place in the population, was thought to be a little bit underrepresentative. I think so far he gets pretty good marks on most of his appointees. And it's interesting, his decision to keep Secretary Gates, which was controversial with some on the left at the time, seems to have been worked out very well. And I believe that he's perceived within the administration as very effective. Likewise, Senator Clinton is perceived as very effective and very adroit at handling the questions that are coming her way. I think in sort of inside the baseball questions, there may be more concern about General Jones as National Security Advisor and how he's making the transition from a lifetime sterling career in the military to the sort of hurly-burly of a more political environment in which his job is really to play traffic cop and priority setter among some other big competing egos. And we saw in the first Bush administration the challenges that Condoleezza Rice had in that job of mediating between big personalities like Rumsfeld and Colin Powell. So we'll see what happens. But I think so far the consensus view seems to be that he's done pretty well, and he has had pretty good luck. None of them have really run into very serious trouble in Congress. Secretary Sebelius got it going over the other day on abortion, which is not surprising since she's from Kansas, where that's a very big.
It's always enjoyable having you come. You're very lively and engaging. But my question actually is, before the appointments, his staff. Could you tell us what you think of David Axelrod, who to me is really the brains behind the whole operation, and Rahm Emanuel?
I know Rahm very well. I've known him, I guess, really for 16 years or so since the Clinton administration. I think highly of both of them. Rahm is a very colorful figure. He's a very authentic figure, and his biography is probably well known to you, but he's the kind of guy who, when he was a teenager working at an Arby's restaurant, he got his finger caught in the meat slicer, and he was too busy to do anything about it. He thought, oh, it'll be fine, and it got gangrene and had to be amputated. So, he's a take charge ahead guy who spent years studying ballet very seriously, but also volunteered in the Israeli Defense Forces in the first Gulf War. And he comes from a very intense, hard-charging family of brothers. As you probably know, his older brother, Zeke, is a medical ethicist of sterling reputation at Harvard and elsewhere. And I believe it's his younger brother, Ari, is an agent in Hollywood who's the model for the Jeremy Piven character in Entourage, the hard-charging, foul-mouthed agent. Rahm, in the Clinton administration, came into the White House as political director, and he got in a lot of trouble with Mrs. Clinton in particular because he rubbed people the wrong way. His personality was very strong. He cursed at people. He yelled at donors. And she tried to fire him, but she wouldn't fire him to his face, so he refused to quit. And he just kept his little office, kept doing things, and he helped pass the crime bill in 1994. And as the president headed into the 1996 election, Rahm was behind all these little initiatives like school uniforms and other, neighborhood watch programs and the kinds of things that President Clinton ran for re-election on. And then I think he also had the perspective of going out in the private sector, working as an investment banker, making a lot of money very quickly, and then coming back and being a member of Congress. And I think it was very painful for him to leave the Congress. He thought he might well have a chance to be the first Jewish Speaker of the House, which was very important to him. He seems to me in some real way to have been born for this job. He knows the president very well. The president trusts him. The trust is total and complete, and Rahm knows something the president doesn't know, which is Rahm knows the White House and he knows the Hill. It was a small thing, but I happened to see him the other day, and it occurred to me, as a former member of Congress, he has the privilege of the floor. So as the White House Chief of Staff, he can go buttonhole members of Congress on the floor of the House, and that's not a small tool to have. He can go to the House gym and buttonhole the Republicans, you know, when maybe they're overexposed. So, or at least vulnerable. Anyway, as to David, I don't know David nearly as well, but I have high admiration for him. He's a former journalist for the Chicago Tribune, and I think he actually sees the world like a storyteller. In modern times, presidential image makers and strategists have tended to be one of two things: ad makers, or photographic people like Mike Deaver or Bob Squire, who worked on many presidential campaigns, or Jerry Rafshoon, who worked for Jimmy Carter, they were fundamentally sort of a filmmaker. Karl Rove was a direct mail expert who knew how to target this voter and that voter, and he saw the world in a mosaic of tiny little individual parts. David is a storyteller, and I think in some ways so is the president. I mean, David is good at making the connections across the whole spectrum and saying, this is what this thing really adds up to. This is the story we're trying to tell. This is what's important about President Obama's goals, and here's how they all link together. He also is very unlike most political strategists that I've known in the past 25 years. Not that he's not capable of being very tough when he needs to be, and not that he's not capable of running a negative ad or so forth, but he's a very gentle kind of Eeyore-ish soul with his droopy mustache and untucked shirt tail, and he seems like a very human figure who's pinching himself that he's there in this job and quite happy to have it. And I think in some ways he's the what's the word I'm looking for? He's a little bit the Jiminy Cricket on the president's shoulder in some ways, giving him a little advice.
Let me ask the closing question. I know that your research on the Sarah Palin story is in its early stages and that you're going to be spending time in Alaska soon, but based on what you've seen so far, to whom is she appealing? What is her message at this point?
I think she appeals very strongly to a lot of people in the country who feel that they're overlooked or forgotten by typical politicians. She appeals to the strong conservative, evangelical Christian base of the modern Republican Party. She clearly appeals to, kind of certain segment of working class moms, as she would say, hockey moms or soccer moms or whatever they are, waitress moms, whatever the demographic of the moment is. And I think she appeals to the part of the country, which is not an insubstantial part, that's basically very traditional in its outlook, and thinks that the government in Washington and the culture at large has gone off the rails and is lost track of fundamental values and needs a good spanking. So I think that her appeal shouldn't. It's probably dangerous to underestimate her appeal. It might be dangerous to overestimate it too, but I think she.
Well, I know that the sales of Vanity Fair will increase dramatically when we get news that your piece is about to appear. Thank you very much, Todd.
Thanks very much to you, George. I really appreciate it.